Welcome everyone. I, Professor Architect Mahesh Bangad, welcome all of you on behalf of the team of the Drawing Board Competition 2020. And it is my pleasure and an honor to be hosting this first of its kind lecture series by the TDB 2020. For those of you who have joined for the first time and don't know about this initiative, I would give a brief introduction about the drawing board. But most of these participants who have participated from all over the globe now already know about this edition of our drawing board competition. It is a national level architecture competition and now an international platform for students of architecture to show up their skills and work on live sites and live projects, concerns that are modern, concerns that are prevalent. And the effort is by Rohan Builders and Mindspace Architects Bangalore. And the endeavor is to create a unique space for interaction for architecture students, bring about conversations and bring together students, professionals, and ideas on a common platform, which will help instigate thoughtful research by design, of course, and also suggest tangible solutions that will create more awareness amongst the students of architecture. Hosted annually once in Pune, the competition itself is a one-day gala affair where eminent juries from different countries guide students and eventually help them become the star architects that they can be or want to be. Unfortunately, this year the times have been testing, and due to the pandemic looming all over large, we thought that we will go online in its fifth edition of our drawing board competition. With that, we are also sure that next year we will be larger and bigger than this as well. Here, I would like to thank all the partners of TDB. We've been really lucky to have received unending support from our fraternity of architecture and construction industry. And we are extremely thankful to each of our ecosystem partners. I'll just quickly mention all their names here. Matter from Goa, who have helped us with our publication. On 25th, we'll be releasing our the drawing book publication, drawing board publication, and BuildCon Architecture Magazine, Livardis, Amazing Architecture, Spacey UX, Architecture Live, India Design World, and Dr. BN College of Architecture, Pune, who have been our venue partners over the past few editions. Now, I'll quickly tell you about the 2020 challenge that has been there. TDB 2020 challenge has been about designing housing for workers. As you all know, when a lockdown was announced in March, all the construction sites were stopped, and the temporary housing, which were housed by these construction workers, they had to be vacated. People who were staying, workers who were staying next to these construction sites also couldn't be housed there due to security concerns and health concerns. And they all had to go back to their hometowns, or some of them didn't even have a place to go back to. This raised a prevalent issue of social housing for construction workers. And taking this as a premise, Rohan Builders, along with Mindspace Architects, took up this relevant challenge of giving a clear intent to give students the necessary exposure and opportunity to deal with a real life scenario and explore solutions that could solve this long-term problem. The Drawing Board 2020 received tremendous response. 14 countries, 1,300 plus registrations, and some wonderful entries breaking all the previous records that we've had in our previous 4 editions. What made it even more special were the jury members who have put in so much of effort to evaluate all your entries and shortlist the top 10, which are going to be evaluated on 25th of November. And here I would like to ask all of you to be there, following our Instagram page, our website for all the updates, because we'll be starting to put all the details out for the 25th of November, the D-Day of the jury. Secondly, we have an interesting online competition for voting by audience to decide the Viewer's Choice Award. So you are most welcome to go online and vote. Of course, all registered participants will be eligible to do that. And today with us, we have architect Bijoy Jain, one of our jury members, esteemed jury members, who's going to do a talk about his architectural journey and also the work, the inspirational work that they are doing at Studio Mumbai in Mumbai. And we are really obliged that our jury members have kindly agreed to do these lecture series for our students, our audience, our professionals, our industry partners as well. So without wasting much time, I'm going to introduce our speaker for the day. Architect Bijoy Jain is the principal architect at Studio Mumbai, received his master's from Washington University, USA in 1990, worked with the famous office of Richard Meier, came back in 1995, set up his practice, Studio Mumbai. Founded in 1995, Studio Mumbai is a human infrastructure of skilled craftsmen and architects who design and build the work directly. And that makes them unique. Gathered through time, this group shares an environment created for an iterative process where ideas are explored through the production of large-scale mock-up models, material studies, sketches, and drawings, something all architecture students should look up to. The essence of their work lies in the relationship between land and architecture. It requires coming terms with the presence of the environment through the succession of seasons. Bijay has designed and built significant works in India and abroad. His work has been presented at many venues, including the Alvar Aalto Symposium, the Architectural League of New York, and of course the Canadian Center for Architecture, where a lot of his work is archived. So welcome, Architect Bijoy Jain, and over to you.
Thank you, Mahesh. Very generous of you for the introduction. I cannot see everyone through the screen, but hello everyone who's listening in. Thank you for being there. What I want to actually share with you is not so much my work, but yes, in a way, it is the work, or it is at the core of the work. So it's a presentation that we'll actually put together for a publication, and I thought it would be appropriate to maybe share that to this audience. And then the second part, I thought I would just share with you my studio. It's a little walkthrough through my studio, and then hopefully, if there's some time, I hope that we can then open it up for some questions. And
yes, that is the intent that we have at the end of the presentation, and I'm sure it is going to be inspirational to listen to your thoughts, as well as to have that walkthrough through your studio, because it's good to know how big offices function. So over to you, sir. Please start the presentation.
So number one, I'm not a big office. I don't understand, when you say that, everyone has to aspire to be a star architect. These are things that are very I think it's interesting how we view architecture, I think, and that's for me something that's important, and that's what I'd like to share with you. We're a very small outfit. I have two young assistants with me. An architect, a young lady in Chennai who's a colleague of mine, and then I have a few. I want to call them, builders, between carpenters, a few masons. But we're all collectively engaged in similar work. It's not exclusive, one to the other. So I just want to, clarify this idea of, what a practice might be like. So I just thought that. But anyway, let me get to my presentation. And yeah. I'll start here.
Yeah, perfect.
This was actually, a question was raised in a publication. David Chipperfield is the one who's the editor of the last, he was the editor for this year. This is a sort of Italian publication. I think now it is in multiple other parts of the world too, and I think here too. But the question was raised, asking the question, what next, in terms of, where we are, I think, globally as a civilization, in terms of, the situation, the interesting time that we're in, what was precedent to that, what is the possibility of what is to come. And so just questions were raised about, how would one look at what we do, and how do we negotiate, doing what we do, or through what we do, this sort of landscape that is, in flux, in changing, it remains unknown. So this was just a sort of our response to the question of what next, and what I think is the practice of the studio. I'm sharing this. There are, collaborators and contributors to this particular project. There's a young, very fine photographer out of Surat. We work together. His name is Mitul Desai. And, we have a sort of a WhatsApp group, and we share just images of what we view in the landscape, of things that I don't want to say inspire, but just more like, it's an observation of what we're watching in the landscape, things that are fleeting, things that are temporary, things that are permanent, and what are the relationships that they're seeing. So it's just more a sort of a window of looking at our environment. But anyway, I'm going to start and just read it out. Civilization is built on an aqueous footing, a world that is in a constant flux, a culture continually in an ebb and flow. Air, light, and water is our essential construct. Man in nature and nature in man is indivisible. I think this is really the premise, for us and for me in particular, the idea of how do you work and how do you interact spatially? And I don't mean spatially in an architectural way, but spatially in a sort of more haptic and a visceral way. And when I use the word haptic, that is, how do we connect with our senses? How do we, because that's where we understand space. Anyway, I'll go on to, so it's the physical world that we inhabit is a palimpsest of our cultural evolution. Immediacy of material and immediacy of actions, of doing and undoing, is a way to negotiate uncertainty. Spontaneity allows us to be agile and adaptable to circumstances beyond our control. Temporality then is not consequential but intentional and can absorb disbalance. There are moments of epiphany, however fleeting, in the space in between. This is important for me, this idea of, where does this space, as we oscillate, in a movement, there's a sort of a space that remains suspended, this space in that what I'm describing as a space in between, it can be fleeting, but it's that moment of being suspended where things happen, there's discoveries that take place, other thresholds open. Our notion of the world is formed through continual engagements with diverse landscapes. We traverse these terrains physically and metaphorically to continually expand our world, discovering phenomena which are discretely present but non-extant in our collective consciousness. A repository of tacit knowledge, a haptic resonating field made from water, air, and light. And I'm using this idea of water, air, and light because that's what constructs us too. So the idea that as much that we are, as much the landscape as to the view of the landscape that we have. So, and that's what I mean, that man in nature, nature in man, or what is outside as an exteriority is also something that is an interiority to us. So it's sort of that making that connection to a sort of haptic field, I think what one sees becomes a priority. Our eyes have, that's how we view things. And that's what then I want to call it becomes a propaganda of how things should be, But when you sort of open the field in a more diverse way of sound, touch, scent, taste, and an intuitive sense, then we have a sort of wider field of how we can look at the same thing. They're informed by sort of different viewpoints. And for me, that's sort of the interesting aspect of what I mean by it's a repository of tacit knowledge, that it's something that is in all of us, outside our boundaries, or not limited to our boundaries, not limited to our race, or not limited to geographies, etc., etc., etc. It's fundamental to every sentient being, tree, animal, man, I mean, all included. Anyway, water, a colorless, transparent, odorless liquid, which forms the seas, lakes, rivers, and rain, and is the basis of fluids of living organisms. Air, the invisible gaseous substance surrounding the earth, a mixture mainly of oxygen and nitrogen. Light, the natural agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible. There's a sort of interesting idea about how light is described, because in light there is shadow. And so this idea of, a resonating field, of how that it's an agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible, which also then resonates the other haptic senses. So anyway, here are just some words that are sort of important to us, that are sort of like a dictionary to us here. This is just an image that I'm sharing with you, and it's interesting. This was actually taken in Rajasthan. It's actually a stone quarry, and it's interesting. In this stone quarry, they build these structures because that's where they take shade from. That's where they take their lunch breaks. The material is immediate. You know, all of it is there, and they sort of. It's this landscape of these pavilions that you see in these stone quarries. A sort of architecture that just is built from the ground. It's like literally length, breadth, and height and structure. You could actually make a drawing, so to speak, on the land itself and do a pop-up building. But anyway, the reason I'm showing this is that quite unique. In March, there was a big flood, or there was a big rain, and this quarry was filled with water. So this idea of how, looking at this idea of an anticipated idea of time, that you can put things in place for a moment when something else can react to it, and then it sort of opens up a whole new possibility. So these images are more provocations. They're not really the intention to, to look at them as inspiring in their form, but more inspiring in the idea of the phenomena that, one is observing in what one is viewing as a picture. I need some water. And this is something, we also call this, we have a book that we have in-house, it's called The Immediate Landscape, and so this is interesting. This is a brick stack. It's the studies of brick stacks that we see sort of in the landscape. Again, the bricks are fundamentally made before the monsoon. So also, how material cycles move in our sort of climatic conditions, in our sort of, in our idea of time, in our idea of lunar time, in our idea of Greenwich Mean Time. But for me, what was interesting is the person on top, he builds his dwelling, and he's actually the caretaker of these mound of bricks. So he's also selling them, he inhabits them. So in a sense, it's also partly nomadic life in the sense that it's transitionary. So this idea of this plinth and this house on top, but you could imagine that these are actually on the fringes of cities. We sort of observe them in cities that are now being built. I just like this image and this idea of anticipated time. There's a how do I say, there's a sort of irreverie about this. There's a certain quality, the two chairs, there's a sense of waiting and anticipation. But anyway, for me, I'm interested in the architecture of the landscape, or the idea of architecture as landscape. That landscape is architecture, not in a birds, plants, and trees, but something that's more expansive, more topological. So anyway, these are just things that we are drawn to. There's sort of an efficiency of how they put these things together. Very rudimentary, but we're very much observing these sort of situations in our landscape, which deal with the idea of architecture in a very immediate way. There's a sort of immediacy to it. For me, this is a very powerful slide. And it's interesting that if you see there's a light, I mean, we have a whole series of these mosquito net dwellings that we've taken. Again, the object is not to kind of look at, is to observe a condition just for what it is, in a way, like in a scientific way. But what's interesting, these are sort of transitioning. These people are transitioning, or they're there for a moment in the city. They then maybe return back to their farms. But this is the time when they're able to sell these goods. They're vendors in the street, and the way they occupy the street, the way they occupy this sort of in between interstitial space of a city, and how they also use the light of the city as a way to protect them. I think that's interesting, this relationship of the light, the mosquito screen or the mosquito net, and a dwelling that's made. I think just that idea of, even in the thinness of that architecture, there's a sort of sense of, quality to the space that's inhabited, just that little energy that's drawn in, but even the way they locate it, the way they make them contextual to the way they work. So it's a very powerful image, I find. Restrain, to hold back from action, especially by force. And this, I'm saying, this is something really important, at least in my own practice or in the practice of the studio, is not so much the idea of action, which does not mean that there is inaction, but there is a moment of waiting. You're working, you work, you practice, but there's also a moment of pause, because the idea is that one develops a sort of momentum, one develops a sort of movement or an acceleration. And we oftentimes lose connection to what provoked, or evoked that movement. So the idea of that waiting, or the idea of pause, is to allow for something to come towards you too. I think that's something for me that is very, very important as a practice, and at least in the way that I endeavor to work. I think for me, what's important is we have begun to look at architecture, at least how I'm viewing it right now, as there's a sort of propaganda of, the idea of built form, And so for me, I'm just sharing with you another view of a built form, another view of an architecture that we see all around us. I mean, this is common to all of us, I think, in all our geographies. It's not centric, yes, these pictures are taken here, but these are sort of situations or scenarios that are unfolding, across continents as we speak right now. Constellation, a group of stars on the celestial sphere, forming a pattern traditionally named after its apparent form. An assemblage, collection, or group of usually related entities, qualities, or things. So these are, I mean, they actually rely, the formation is because of formation of the group. As the group thins out, the person that is last, that is left behind, they're more fragile. So it's interesting how they collectively organize themselves. And, even in so they're working on the roads. This is what they set up. They use the street lights. And it's an interesting phenomenon how they work and move as a group within a city or within a landscape, between the idea of the monsoons, between summer, between, winter, just the way that they actually traverse sort of partly or semi-nomadic. But for me, they're sort of very powerful pictures that are kind of documenting our landscape in real time. Also relationships, relationship of what they are reliant on, and how they are also included in part of the same infrastructure, if you want to speak. I'm fascinated by these sort of temporary coverings when buildings are being constructed, and somehow the buildings that we see when they're being constructed, for me, they're quite special in terms of there's already an infrastructure, so the question being asked is, how much do we have to really do? What is it that we really have to do? And so this is just a provocation to the question of, where does, the idea of architecture, of the idea of verticality being looked at more as a landscape than as a building. This is a beautiful image just in terms of, the location. There's a sense of darkness, a distance in the foreground. There's this, a portrait of this woman on the rickshaw. So there's a complexity. There's this sort of weaving of many complex things that are going on at the same time between rural, between urban, all the lines there's a kind of osmosis taking place. So for me, it's just a very powerful picture. Azimuth, this is the horizontal angular distance of a celestial object measured clockwise around the observer's horizon from north. Again, this is a picture of Tazias. I think this is taken in a place called Kadegaon. And every year they have a procession. I think it is just at the last day of Moharram. And these towers are taken out. And there are about 50 people carrying these towers that are about, 10 floors high. And they sort of construct them, they arrange them. And it's a beautiful sort of ritual or a sequence where these towers sort of are made to intersect with each other. This sort of like a moving field of, architecture that's moving. And again, very temporary, but for me, this is, powerful sort of, how do I say, there's a great amount of immediacy, this idea of temporality, this idea of, movement. Again, not so much that that's how we should build. I'm just saying that all of this is part of our landscape. So I think it's just, for me, it's important that it's raising questions of, how do we participate? How do we interact with the landscape that we have to interact? I would love to build buildings like this. This is what, I would love to be able to do architecture like this. All the pictures that I'm showing you, for me, this is, this is some, amazing stuff that's going on. And this is actually along the highway. There's, shop after shop or resting house after resting house. I think this was on the way to Jaisalmer. So this is just a fragment of that sort of landscape of the street. But again, it's not so much about the handmade. It's not so much about the industrial. It's about what you can do, how you can participate, how can you embed yourself into a landscape, and how do you draw from the landscape of the immediacy of whatever there might be around you. One that doesn't really take prejudice about, something that looks this way or not. And for me, these pictures are in some way communicating. For me, these are quite incredible pieces of architecture. This is interesting. There's a whole industry which is, it's a formal, informalized. That I think we're one of the few countries where, of course, building safety, all of those are in question, but that's a different discussion for the moment. I'm just saying that what's interesting is that the way we build, it's in the same way that we know how to take a building down. And for me, that's, that's an opportunity of a way of constructing this idea of length, breadth, height, and structure. This idea that what if you made a space where the only definition you gave was, it's this long, this wide, this high, or whatever shape it might want to be, and that's it. There's nothing else to that. And then you go about actually going back to the building and as an idea of opening it up. So you actually using subtraction or using a way like we would take buildings down. I don't want to call them demolished because they don't really demolish these buildings. They very craftfully know how to take away and slowly, bit by bit, take all the parts down. So there's, at every given moment, there's a sort of opportunity that unfolds, a sort of opening up of a space. So I'm just looking at this method of dismantling as a possible way that one can actually build. This is an interesting slide. This is actually Humayun's tomb. This was being restored. And so these domes are being made. This one on the right that you can see is complete, and the one on the left. And the one on the left is actually scaffolding. If you look at that, that's form work to make the dome on the right. Now, the formwork itself is architecture in the same way that it's a negative of a positive, and yet it somehow contains a space. So here I'm just asking the question that what if we were able to visualize not the form, but the formwork as an idea of making things, because it's another way. It's a kind of like a mirror image, that how can you see the inverse of what you're building as a strategy to build what you want to build. And I think that's what I'm sort of raising in this picture, this pretty powerful stuff, because the formwork is what is actually building the stuff on the right. I mean, you could take that material and build what is on the right, or they're the same, made of the same material. So that's that visual field of those pavilions I was talking about from the first slide. Just the sort of array, and all of this just depends on only one thing. Of course, there's a dimension, there's a proportion, there's a sense of weight, and it all depends on gravity. It's basically just gravity, it's just pure weight that's keeping these structures in the way that they are. So sort of interesting of how, the land, the mass, the volume, the air, it's like literally taking an opaque, the idea of opacity, and then you kind of open it up. This, for me, that's what's being revealed in this. Again, it's not a nostalgic idea of the picture. It's, just looking at the phenomena of what's occurring right there. These are actually marble slurry fields in Udaipur, which is where a lot of the marble that is cut, marbles, big slabs of marble are sent to Udaipur, actually from worldwide. They also come from Italy and from other places. So there are these sort of landscapes or these mounds that are of acres, 8 stories high, and they're just basically dumping the slurry. They use water to cut the marble. So the slurry that comes off that water with the marble dust is then put into these trucks, and they just built. There are these sort of plateaus, if you want to call it, like a few acres wide. So this idea of we've been looking at this idea of this landscape of how does one participate in this landscape. I don't want to call it waste, because what's interesting is that few feet below you, basically it's filled with water. That whole mountain is held with this water. If the water had to dissipate, the whole mountain would basically, powder up and like fall apart. So it's interesting that this phenomenon of this, what is seen as waste, is holding this water, and a possibility of how one can actually enter into this landscape to maybe make something, do something, even for a brief moment in time. So this is just a picture of some of our field studies. Irreverie of a state or entity which has the character of a dream, but which is rooted in reality. So this is again images of the Tazia. For me, this is, building, the images that you see. I mean, they're models for a building, 40 minutes remaining. This is, of course, taken in Banaras, and it's this, I mean, there's this kind of sense of movement. There's a pause, there's a stillness. So just a sort of very beautiful image for me, just in terms of what it suggests, this sort of, a relationship, of man in nature, nature in man, that, and that we're indivisible. And it sort of communicates, I think, that quality, this particular picture. This for me is a very poignant picture. We all know of the Da Vinci Man, the sort of the whole diagram and the idea. And of course, then we have the Nataraj, which is our view of that idea of it's actually the dance. It's more in a state of dance because it uses the diagonal. If you look at the Nataraj and the posture of the Nataraj, it's actually talking about the diagonal for me, which is very particular because it's the idea of the rotational axis of the earth. Everything is moving on a diagonal. And here's sort of this image in that way has these layers of embedded iconography, if you want to call it, of this idea of, the standing man, Nataraj, water, this architecture that is submerged, this is on the banks of in Banaras, so just in the way, and also the glance of the person on the right. So it's a very sort of, it's a beautiful, I mean, for me, it's just, it's sort of, in some way contains all that is coded or embedded in this image for me. It's a very powerful image. That sort of really nearly suspended space, a body of water that's a film right below you. Get some water. So this is actually in Surat, and these boats, what they do is they go out during the low tide, and they dredge the estuary for sand. And it's an actually informal business because they don't have any motors. None of these boats have motors, so they use the tidal, the tidal flux. So during low tide, they actually go out, dredge the estuary, fill the boats, and during high tide, these boats are brought back. So just uses the tidal flux to create this movement. From here, it transitions into trucks, the sand, which then goes towards construction sites into our cities that are basically forming the cities. So that was, just to demonstrate this idea of flux, of civilization being built on an aqueous footing, this idea of a relationship to the idea of tidal flux or lunar time, and how deeply it is embedded or coded within us. This idea of haptic time that I'm calling is sort of coded in this idea of lunar time. And so here they're actually using that in-between space, that allows them to actually participate in a sort of economics, if you want to call it that, of informal and formal, and where those lines of economics sort of begin to blur within each other. So this is sort of, in a way, a document of that economics. These are, houses. You were talking about migrant housing, and this is in Surat. This is, growing city. Mithul is from Surat, and he kind of moves around in the landscape. And so these units that are built by, developers or who built these for these, all in the construction business, but quite interesting in the sense of where, the intention of the facade, of what that communicates, or the importance of the facade. And I mean, it's quite a, beautiful picture. You can see an agrarian landscape in the foreground, and this that is slowly, slowly building itself up. This is a school. I don't know where it is, but just the way, I mean, I guess I'm showing this because for me, I would, I would love to be. I mean, this is just powerful work. It's not. We don't know who the, it's anonymous in a way, but it's really powerful stuff. Very logical. There's a sort of directness to it. There's a sense of an economy. There's a sense of expression of its location. And I'm sharing it because we don't get to see all of this. So I'm just sharing stuff that I enjoy, being inspired by. And also these bars that you can see on top, this idea of continuity, how that also becomes part and parcel of the building itself, this idea of a sort of continuous landscape that in time will accrue itself. Angle of repose, the steepest angle at which a sloping surface of loose material is stable. Another way to describe it is a state of rest. That is, it's the resting state where no force is applied. That's that idea of, restraint, angle of repose. It's where one is at ease, but in a sort of stillness. The weight of gravity, if you want to call it that, is spread out in a way that you're sort of equanimous to that idea of gravity. So I mean, just showing you some abstract pictures of, just earth that has slipped to form that angle of repose. This is salt, and you can see it's just salt and water. It's water that's, holding it up. You drain away the water, and slowly this will sort of crystallize. I mean, it'll be compact, but it also requires the humidity to keep it how it is. These are actually how lime is slaked or baked, actually, rocks. You can see the image on the right, and they go up these steps, and then they put them through the tube on the top, and there's a fire below, and then they sort of extract it. So for me, I've been interested in lime because it's one of the, materials that actually improves in time. Calcium hydroxide, that turns into calcium carbonate and then returns back to being calcium hydroxide, CaOH2. But it's a material that actually formalized our understanding of architecture. That was the sort of, I don't want to call it the glue, but that was the mediator, if you want to call it that, that allows us to see sort of our civilized landscapes, all the way going back to the Indus Valley and maybe, predating that. Posture, the word comes from the Latin verb ponere, which means to put or place. To observe this concept implies an implicit understanding of the carriage of the body as a whole, its approach, attitude, or positioning of the arms and legs in relation to the object which is being manipulated. To the right of that, there's a picture, and it's not sort of a touristy picture. It's, I mean, one can pass, this. For me, it's interesting, the relationship, of this child, of the animal the child is on, and an animal with the child, which is on an animal. So if you look at the complexity of the relationship, and there is a certain exchange and an experience that is going on, something that over time, and it's not, it's just the way it is. But what I want to share is that this capacity that you see in this image, that is the capacity we have. That's that's how tenacious, and that's the sort of extent of what we can contain as an idea of thought or as an idea of architecture. So the image here is more to communicate the sort of possibility of relationships that we can actually have in our built environment, and so it's more sort of out there to sort of provoke that question. This is actually a shot from the plane. It's a village in Banaras. Series of courtyards. I mean, quite old. I think some of it is now been demolished. I mean, these were taken a few years ago. I'm just showing the juxtaposition of, the landscape of time. This is near the airport. I think somewhere near Chhattisgarh, if I'm correct, somewhere. But there's this whole village, and they know they're going to move. Will have to move. It's all built basically from what's found on the ground. So you can see, and again, I don't want to show this to you as a kind of nostalgic or a sentimental way. I'm showing this more in terms of with how little what we're actually capable of, with very minimum means. This is our possibilities. So when we have all the means, then the possibility has to be even bigger than this in that sense. And how we're able to accumulate, there's a certain relationship, certain energy field that's formed. So anyway, this is for me one of my most favorite words, affection. It is the ability to observe and to identify with another situation or condition, and to then care for it and protect it in the hope to provide it with what it needs to be itself. Gravity, the force that attracts a body towards the center of the earth or towards any other physical body having mass. So here again, it's not that different from the images of the stone quarry. It's the ground that's been compacted, what is seen as an opaque surface, no different from Ajanta Ellora, no different from the rocks that we cut into. The action is the same in that sense. The sensibility of the action or the motivation of the action is from the same source. And here you can see, just by lifting the earth up, and again, it's not because it should be an earth structure. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about our ability to participate in a landscape and make something in that relationship of what the landscape has to offer to us and what we have to offer to the landscape as a mutual exchange. One that makes contact both ways. Maybe these people this was just taken before the lockdown, I mean, for me, this is powerful stuff. I mean, it's talking about, it's even talking about our politics, everything that's going on today. So it's not just an architecture for architecture, but it's, it's about politics too. It's about, and when I mean politics, I'm talking about, the idea of immediacy, the idea of self-reliance, the idea of governance, the idea of self-governance, etc., etc. They're all embedded and loaded in, into what you're seeing as a landscape right now. And this is what we're taking down, in the search for something else. It's not so much of not taking it down, but it's about at least asking ourselves some very fundamental questions of how can we participate when this is the stuff that is already there. Dwell, to live or endure in a given condition or state, a slight regular pause in the motion of a machine. This kind of reminds me of, Rothko's paintings, where what, again, the distinction, and I'm not calling it art, architecture, sculpture, but they're very clear entities that are separate but are yet connected. But where they stem from or where they originate from us is in how we participate. So the origin in some way is also equally important in the way that we participate. Here you can see this is actually very close to Kadapa, this village, if I'm correct. But we don't see architecture documented. We don't see work like this. We're looking, the way that we are taught, the way that we're made to read the books. what we're looking at. And again, it's not so much to emulate this. I think there are more fundamental questions of, how that participation, how those contacts are made to materiality, to the idea of ground, to the idea of inhabitation, and there's no judgment being made, in terms of, even you can see the sort of, deep into the picture, there's these sort of same stainless steel racks. Yeah. And we're wiping this out, in millions. Manner, from the French manière, substantivized use of the adjective meaning done with one's hands, a notion which reveals a method of execution or a way of doing, especially with regards to the outward manifestation of an embodied process. So here you're seeing, there's the same house divided in half, one for the animals and one for the human occupation. And the sort of opening, they come through the same opening, or I think the openings are right next to each other. But the image on the left is quite interesting, the way that it takes the shape of the inhabitants of that space. And that's just the subtlety of, how tuned, tuned in this idea of proportions, tuned in this idea of, this idea of measure. This image on the right, the lady with she's got two kitchens, If you look at, and I'm referring fundamentally, okay, right now to 200-300 million people here in our country. I would say about half of that, so 500 million people still sit on the ground. They occupy the ground to eat, they occupy the ground to cook, they occupy the ground to make, the ground is so important. And for me here, it's a very powerful image to see that in between space, there's one that is, more European or a Western idea of a kitchen, something that's standing, and one that's seated, the fuels that are used, that are generated for both, and each one in particular for what it is. But for me, I'm just questioning, there's an opportunity for us to look at what's going on right now. This is what's happening right now. And how do we bring this into the possibility of what we are doing? I think, and this is for me like, it's very rooted and connected to this idea of a cultural evolution that is taking place, and doesn't take a prejudice to say that it's one or the other. It's the idea that both are sort of coexisting in the same place. This is a nomadic, the nomadic people. I think this is also, again, in the northwest part. But what I want to share with you is, materiality, clothing, architecture, cocoon, and this idea of that haptic quality of, where it starts. Like, I mean, with this idea of minimum means, again, it's not one, it's looking at the potential of idea of materiality, the idea of inhabitation, the idea of occupation, like in the sense of how we occupy space, even in being transient, and I'm using transient as a metaphor, it's not so much to say that this is the landscape we have to mimic. For me, the interest is, this is, the ethos that is possible. That's what we can learn from. And I think that's what is my intention. This is a sort of research that continues in the studio every day. Every day something is discovered, things that we see that in somehow, provoke us to sort of look deeper into the things that we are doing. I'm going to now quickly switch you to my studio, which is like, I think, a 7-8 minute sort of walkthrough, and then we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, that will be great. So we'll wait for the walkthrough, and once that is done, I already have received a lot of questions from the audience, so we'll take them up.
So this is just, I'm just showing you every day something new is made. Not because it has a purpose, not because it has a project. So one doesn't actually wait for projects. This is a sort of everyday practice that occurs. These pieces that you see in the, the larger big rock pieces are actually the metro in Bombay was being dug out, and we had the opportunity to have this material delivered to the studio. They just send a truck, we have to pay for the truck, and that's it. So this is all just pure clay, nothing else. It's just compressed clay. So earth that is being dug out, that's what's at the bottom. So it comes, everything that came out comes in the reverse. This is a dry stacked wall. So again, what is the purpose behind them? The purpose is just to actually make these things a possibility that in a moment in time, that if I had to think of these things, it would not be possible, economically too. So everything you see here is all made in the studio. Less a few pieces that are collected, which are fragments of the city. That's actually a drawing of a project, and it's actually clay. It's the one that you saw at the far. And the studio gets arranged every few weeks. New work comes in, things change. So the studio the studio itself is the practice of architecture in a way that it's about haptics, it's about space, it's about the discipline of how you occupy a space, how things change. So from a distance, you might see these as concrete. They're not concrete. It's just compressed clay. And the only reason they're together is because it's got water inside. If I sucked away all the water, these things would just collapse. This is bitumen tar. Not asphalt, because asphalt will have sand and stone in it. This is pure bitumen. And these have actually collapsed over a period of time. So that piece in the middle is actually carved out, it's a cast. So we're exploring the idea of negative and positive of, so all of these, so even the ropes are made, the guys, these are pieces of furniture that require no machinery, very simple tools, no glue. things that are broken, fragments of something, but everything is preserved. We can kind of keep it as a archive, not so much to look at the form or to just to look at, what was the motivation of how things came about, what was, what is embedded in them. There's a research, so from making silk threads, to bricks, salt, anything, everything is open for that exploration. Colors of these are colors that we produce in-house. Just research on colors. So each project will go through like 50 different, sometimes 50 different iterations, like slight adjustments. These bottles at the bottom of the screen are made out of soap. If you're looking at a laundry, so for me, the idea, the practice is to explore everything, it's everything that has to do with our haptic sense. That's all in the field of our profession. That's Vitruvius, talked about this idea of what it means to be an architect, and that it included basically everything from biology, philosophy, mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, blah blah. It just kind of goes on listing it, and that the idea is that to become the master of those fields, which is a sort of impossible task. So for me, the idea is it's more the pursuit of that possibility that's more important. So all of this is research. All this stuff you see, it's all research. Super. Stop.
Wow. That was like a studio as a working lab itself. I suddenly received several requests in the chat box saying, when can we visit this masterpiece? Uh, Truly inspiring. And thank you for those wonderful, strong metaphorical images because uh, not every day you get to see such images, is one thing. And you talked about architecture without really showing us too much of architecture, which was very important for all of us to understand, I think. And another takeaway that I had is from those slides where you showed about measure. Yeah.
I only showed you architecture, nothing else.
Well, yeah. But the word metaphorical remains. I think the metaphors were great.
Only architecture, nothing else. Anyway, go
And
ahead.
the slide that showed the measure and also the kitchen that you showed, I think it really spoke about how architecture responds to the user. There are questions on user as well. So I will quickly take a few audience questions if you don't mind. Uh, the first one is from a student asking about what is the relationship between a temporary dwelling and the landscape where it's going to settle. Do you think they kind of correspond to each other?
Okay, so there are two ways to answer the question. One in terms of temporality that is immediate, and one that is an idea of temporality that is built in time as the idea of longevity.
True.
I think, so for me, what I would say is that, and so can you go back sort of to the sort of core of the question so that I may
So
answer?
it says, what relationship do you think is there between the temporary dwelling and the landscape where it is going to settle?
So right at the onset, I said man in nature, nature in man, and both are indivisible. Okay. I'm using this to say that that is where the architecture is formed in response to the reflection of the question of the context of the relationship of the two, right? The temporality, the immediacy of the landscape, and the immediacy of the inhabitor. Right? That's being asked. Yeah. So
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that if you are able, and that's why I said that we all have haptic space. We are all constructed from haptic space. We're all constructed from water, air, and light. And I think the best way I can answer it, as long as you allow an osmosis of air, water, light as a permeation between the idea of temporality, interiority, exteriority, and landscape. It's breathing.
Yes. Yeah. More symbiotic and synergetic.
Yeah, it's alive, fleetingly, or in time of longevity. It's breathing. And for me,
Yes.
that, because even a building covered in, I'm just putting a sort of extreme, just as a, not an opposition, but just so that maybe I can place what I mean by that, what I'm saying, that even a glass steel building is temporal in the idea of, how it occupies the landscape. Our idea of time is a matter of perception of time. And I'm speaking about broadly. I mean, I know the student asked it from a sort of more simpler way. And so I'm saying that, for me, if you're attentive to your landscape, those mediations or negotiations will show themselves. And that's what I was wanting to share in this, is that, that sometimes, because of also very extreme conditions these people have to go, so they have to, you can see that there's a sort of richness in the way that they're able to bring dignity in how they occupy space, even though it's being constricted, space is being constricted for them. I'm saying that, hey, this is what's possible in a very constricted space. So, what is our possibility? Should be magnanimous to include all this that I've just shown in the scope of discussion of architecture.
Very important. Because I think it also makes a point that came as a question actually, but you have cleared that point that architecture, though temporary, can also become timeless by its existence, maybe by its metaphorical existence or by the impression it creates. There's a question that kind of relates to this is how does one strike a balance between pursuing architecture as a craft and also serving to the client's demands?
I think the latter will sort itself out as long as you're in pursuit.
So as long as you stick to the guns that you have.
Just stay to the core, the rest will happen.
Rest will happen, of course. There's another question. Yeah.
This does not mean that I'm not attentive or in contact or in connection with, I'm calling client. You know, I think the important aspect here to observe is how inclusive can you make your environment? Because in that, then you embed time.
Yes.
Because that might be there as your client, and I've had situations where I built for someone and someone else is now occupying the space. Does it have to be occupied in a different way? Yeah, there'll be nuances. But the idea to what I'm saying is to anticipate a civilization that has not been formed yet. You know, that's when we're talking about the sort of broadness of what we can do, what we are capable of, or what we are capable of with what we are pursuing to do.
Yes. I think there's another question that come from Gaurav here. You constantly use the word, or we generally in our day-to-day life use the word progress. How do you address that word or that phenomena through your work or the people you design for?
I think shared discovery, I'm saying that learning only occurs when you discover, otherwise there's no learning. Then you just know it. I'm just first trying to put together this idea of the word what is the meaning of progress, right? Yes, if I can transfer, and that's the idea of affection, because in my view, that phenomena of affection is what has sustained us as a civilization so far. So for me to progress is how do I transfer affection again and again and again and again and again. And that's what is exchanged, whether it's a client or whoever else. That's for me the only thing that I would consider as true progress. The other things would, like I said, they will come and go. I think we're getting, this idea of the digital age, the industrial age, the age of, those are just defined. Yeah, of course, that movement will take place. But what is at the core that allows that to occur? I think that's, for me, the motivation of what allows that progress to occur. And that comes in that discovery. But that notion of continuity being the generator of that movement.
Very important. In terms of progress, very, very important. There are many questions. I've received more than 10 odd questions already, and I don't think we really have time to take them. But there's a personal question that I have for you, and that's where we'll take it as last. Do you think architecture in the modern times is more about form than function? How do you respond? Of course, I personally believe that form follows function, but do you think that the current generation is more towards the form than the function?
I'm not able to answer that question. I don't know what the current generation, I mean, yes, I work with them. I think both can generate each other, and not one or the other is more or less in a hierarchy of things. Yeah. And I'm saying this because I think one of the things which I've become extremely aware of, and I'm using the word prejudice and I'm using the word propaganda, because propaganda creates prejudice, an aesthetic prejudice. So when you say form and function, you're making an aesthetic prejudice one way or the other.
True.
So if I remain in waiting, and I'm going back to the origin of where I started, this idea of being in waiting, of whichever one shows up as the one that evokes the movement, that's all that's important. Why should I say form is less important than function, and why should I say function is more, or vice versa? Why do I need to make that distinction? Because both of them are embedded in each other anyway. So for me, what's important is how do I stay equanimous to both?
The balance is very important.
Saying the equanimity, the balance may come, may not come. Sometimes it's okay to be in imbalance, because the idea of balance can be also seen as, an idea of imbalance, because it suggests another sort of movement. And so, but to answer very specifically, for me, it's not important which one is more or the other. Just, I think this is something that one must, at least for myself, is that every decision or every time I know something, it's not so much I want to forget it. It's how do I remain connected and separate from it at the same time? How do you maintain a detached, connected relationship, which is where you're always, each other are free in that way. So whether it's form or function, I'm open to both.
Wonderful. Thank you for answering it that way. I think it's been truly inspiring, and we loved the presentation and the talk that you have delivered. Thank you very much, Bijoy Jain, and we look forward to listening from you more on 25th. That's when the jury day. It's going to be a long day with some wonderful presentations from the shortlisted entries, and I'm sure the dialogue is going to engage all our audience. We will part ways today here. We are on time. But before that, I officially want to thank you. And of course, on behalf of Rohan Builders and Mindspace Architects. And we thank the audience for tuning in today. But don't forget to tune in tomorrow as well, same time, 4:45, where we have another of our juror presenting. And then on 24th, we have our third juror presenting their talks. Most importantly, please follow us on Instagram and visit our website as well, thedrawingboard.in, because that is where all the updates are. And we have started an online voting for the Viewers' Choice Award, which you could visit and vote for. We have posted the links for tomorrow in the chat box and also for the 24th as well. So you could copy them from there. But we would look forward to have you on both days as well as on the 25th, which is the D day. And I'm sure there's a lot of takeaway today as well. I personally have a lot to take away. I wrote down a lot of notes while which I was presenting, and I realized that there is so much to learn from everything that is around us, right from the Banaras photographs that you showed to the mud house and the kitchen. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bijay, for an enlightening talk, and wish everyone a good evening ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.